So now that we have worked with Docker and we have pushed images to a repository, we can actually create a Docker repository on Nexus, and we can push our images to Nexus Docker repository. For that, in the administration and configuration view, where we manage our repositories, we can create a new repository here. And from the list, we're going to choose Docker hosted because we're going to be pushing our own Docker images to this repository. And we can call it Docker hosted. We'll leave all this configuration for now as is and select my store, blob store, which we created in the Nexus part, and leave the rest as is. And with this, we can create a repository. And if I click inside, here I have the URL of the repository, which we can use to push the images to this repository. Now, in order to start pushing our Docker images to this Docker repository, we first have to log into Nexus using a Nexus user, which has access to Docker hosted repository. And we're going to do that using Docker login command. So the first thing we need to do is create a new role that has a privilege or access to Docker hosted repository, just like we did for Maven repository. So I'm going to create a new role. Let's call it NX Docker. Let's use the same name. And here in the list, we have, again, admin prefix is for administrators who are managing and administering this repository. View is for the users. So we're going to take Docker hosted privilege and assign it to this role and create a role. And we can assign that role to our existing user that already has access to Maven repository. So we're going to add Docker repository permission to it and save the user. So now this user can be used to access and log in into Nexus using Docker login command. So let's go ahead and do that as well. Now, there are a couple of things we need to configure in order to be able to execute Docker login with a Nexus user successfully. The first thing that we need to do in Nexus is go to our Docker hosted repository, and we're gonna edit this field right here, the HTTP. Now, the reason for it is that Docker client cannot connect to a path which represents a Docker repository. So we cannot use this as an endpoint for Docker login. The endpoint we can use for Docker login will be an IP address and the port, right? However, this port is where Nexus itself is running, right? So we need a port for Docker repository specifically. So its own individual port where Docker repository will be accessible at. And this is exactly what we can configure right here. And this repository connectors section that you see right here is only available for Docker registry type. You don't have it in Maven and other types. And we're using a not secure connection for Nexus. So we're going to configure the HTTP for our Docker repository. So I'm going to click on this, and here we can set a port, which is different from a Nexus port. And let's just take 8083, for example, and we're going to save that change. So now that we have configured this port for our Docker repository, this repository is now accessible at IP address of the server where Nexus is running and the port that we defined here. So if I go back to our droplet where Nexus is running and I do netstat lnpt, here you see this is the Nexus port, and now another port just got opened on that server, on this droplet, for 8083. So we can actually connect to this port in order to talk to Docker repository. Cool. So that's configured. Another thing that we need to do in order to be able to access this port is to open this port on a Droplet's firewall configuration. So let's go to DigitalOcean. And in networking firewalls, this is the firewall that is attached to our Droplet. We need to open that port. Otherwise, all the requests from Docker login or Docker other commands from Docker client won't be able to access the port if we're not exposing it. So let's do custom and 8083, save. Now we have opened the port, and that port will allow us to talk to Docker repository. And the final thing we need to configure in Nexus itself is something called a realm. So what happens is that when we do Docker login, we get a token of authentication from Nexus Docker repository for a client, right? And that token will be stored then on my local machine in a file called config.json in the .docker folder in my home directory. And this JSON file will include all the authentications that I have made to all the different Docker repositories. If you haven't logged into a Docker repository ever from your laptop, you won't have this file. The first time you log into any Docker repository, Docker Hub, AWS, Docker repository, or Nexus, this file will be generated with the authenticated token or authentication token inside. And then this token will be used every time you interact with that repository. So if you push images, if you pull images into the repository or from the repository, then this token will be taken from the config.json, right? So we need to configure in Nexus issuing, so to say, of that token. And we can do that in realms. And here you see Docker Bearer token realm. And we're going to activate it because it's inactive by default. And we're going to save it. And all the configuration is done in Nexus. However, we still have one configuration to do in the Docker itself. And the reason for that is that Docker by default only allows client requests whenever we execute a command like Docker login, Docker pull, Docker push, all these commands to go to and talk to an HTTPS endpoint, a secure endpoint of a Docker registry. And because we have a not secure registry, so to say, because our Nexus is running on HTTP, we haven't configured it yet, we need to configure Docker client to allow our Docker hosted repository as an insecure registry. So we are telling Docker, look, we know this registry, this is ours, so I want to allow it as an exception, and I'm going to configure that as an insecure registry. The way you do that in a Linux system is by editing a file called daemon.json. This is Docker daemon at this path, and then adding an insecure registries list to that file. However, if you're using a Docker desktop, either for Mac or Windows, you will not have this file locally at any path because Docker desktop actually starts as a virtual machine on your Mac or Windows. So it has its own virtual file system, so to say. And you can access that file system, that virtual file system of Docker desktop. However, it's a little bit more complicated, and we're going to do it the easy way. And the easy way is to go to your Docker desktop UI and into settings here, and then into the Docker engine menu. And here we have already some configuration. And on the next line, after experimental, we're going to add this line. So insecure registries, and this is the IP address of Nexus. This is where Nexus is running. And this is the port of Docker repository on Nexus, right? This is what we configured here, because that's where the Docker repository is accessible now. So we're going to say this is insecure registry. You can provide here a list and apply and restart. And Docker daemon or Docker engine will allow us to send client requests, Docker client requests to that registry with HTTP. So let's wait for Docker to restart. So Docker is running again. And now we can actually authenticate with Docker, and we can do Docker login. So I'm going to do Docker login. So in Docker login, we are going to provide the registry endpoint, the IP address, and port of the repository. And this will ask for your Nexus username, which is authenticated to interact with this repository. And login succeeded. And what happened here is that the docker config.json file we mentioned earlier got updated. So this file now has the token that Docker repository issued back to our client, so that we don't have to log in every time we execute commands to the repository. So if I did Docker login again, it doesn't ask me for the credentials anymore because it has my token, the authentication token. And now that we are logged in to Docker repository, we can actually push images to that repository. So how do we push an image to our Nexus Docker repository? So first we're going to build an image. So we're going to change into the directory that contains Docker file. And then we're going to build an image with this name and a tag. The image is built. And now we will need to retag that image. We need to tag this image, an existing image, to include the address or the name of the repository itself. And as you already learned from the previous videos, when we execute Docker push, we don't specify explicitly the repository where it needs to push to, but rather we implicitly include it in the name of the image itself. So I'm going to take that image that I just built and I'm going to retag it, so to say. And the new tag will include the address, the endpoint of the repository, port of the repository, 8083, and then we can take the name and version or tag of our existing image. So this becomes part of our new image name. However, it implicitly tells Docker where to push this image to. So if I execute this command, now I will have Docker images. One with the simple tag with my image, and another one including the address of Docker repository. So now we can do Docker push using the name, the complete name of the image, and it will know to push this image to this address. And you see different layers are getting pushed. And the image got pushed. Now if you go back to Nexus, let's go to the repositories, Docker hosted, and here you see the image. We can expand it, have the tags, manifests, and some more assets. So here you see this is the component that got pushed, and this component has a bunch of assets which are different layers of Docker. So this is the same tag here that you see right here. So the image and its different layers got actually pushed into the repository. And as I mentioned previously in the Nexus part, in Docker repository, the components and assets are actually handled a little bit differently compared to other repositories. You have the different layers of the image that you see here. They got pushed one after another. They actually get treated and handled as assets. And these assets or layers can be used by other Docker images as well. And that's why this type of structuring. So we have uploaded our image to Docker repository. We can also pull the images from there because we have authenticated ourselves and the authentication token is locally stored, so we don't have to log in to the repository again. And we can also fetch the available Docker images from the repository using Nexus API. So we can do curl with Nexus user, password. This is the endpoint, components, and repository will be Docker hosted. And if I execute this, I'm going to have the item. We just have one item there. This is the ID and its assets. In this case, also one asset listed here in a JSON format. So this way you can retrieve the Docker images from endpoint with some information.